Part 2. The next morning, Jake and Paul woke up to an unsettling quiet. The strange sense of mystery from the previous night still hung over them like a thick fog. They had gone to bed exhausted, but with restless minds, unable to shake the images of the symbols and the eerie atmosphere of the pyramid. It wasn't just the discovery that bothered them. It was the feeling that something bigger, something they didn't fully understand, was happening. They met in the hotel lobby and discussed their plans for the day. Paul was already pulling out his camera, which had captured pictures of the strange symbols inside the pyramid. They'd been so focused on getting out of there safely that neither of them had fully processed the significance of the images. "We should review the photos," Jake suggested, his voice low as he sat down at a table with Paul. "Maybe there's something we missed." Paul nodded and started scrolling through his camera. He had taken several pictures, some of the symbols, some of the figures on the walls, and a few shots of the strange object that had been in the room. It had all felt so surreal in the moment, but now, looking at the photos, it felt even stranger. Jake leaned in, looking over Paul's shoulder as the photos loaded. "What the hell?" he muttered. The photos that had shown strange symbols, figures, and the mysterious object inside the pyramid were completely blank. Every single one of them. The walls appeared completely bare, as though the symbols and images had never been there at all. Paul's hand trembled as he scrolled through the pictures again. This doesn't make sense. He clicked through them again, but the result was the same. Empty walls, no signs of the strange figures they had seen the night before. Jake grabbed the camera from him. "Let me see." He clicked through the photos, his disbelief growing. "There's nothing here. But we saw it, Paul. We saw it with our own eyes." Paul's face was pale. "I don't know what's happening. This is insane. We both know what we saw." Jake sat back, his mind racing. "Someone's messing with us. I don't know who, but this doesn't feel like a coincidence." Before they could say anything else, the hotel phone rang. Paul answered it, and there was nothing but silence on the other end. He frowned, holding the receiver away from his ear for a moment. "Hello?" he asked again, but the line was dead. "What the hell?" Paul muttered, hanging up the phone. "That's the second time this has happened today?" Jake was already walking toward the door, his eyes narrowing. "I've got a bad feeling about this." They both stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what was happening. Something was definitely wrong. The strange occurrences in the pyramid had followed them back to the hotel. They couldn't explain the disappearance of the photographs, and the mysterious phone call only added to their unease. They decided to go out for a walk to clear their heads. As they left the hotel, the oppressive heat of the Egyptian desert surrounded them. The air felt heavy, thick with tension, and the usual sounds of the city seemed muffled, distant. They walked down the dusty streets, trying to process the strange events. The further they went, the more they noticed something unsettling. It felt like they were being watched. They couldn't see anyone following them, but the sensation of being observed was impossible to shake. Paul glanced over his shoulder and spotted a black car parked further down the street, its windows tinted so dark that he couldn't make out who was inside. He shrugged it off at first, but then the car started moving, slowly creeping in their direction. Jake noticed it too, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. "Do you think they know we were in the pyramid?" Paul's jaw clenched. "I don't know, but I don't like it. We need to get out of here. Now." They quickened their pace, walking briskly back toward the hotel, the black car following at a distance. Every time they glanced over their shoulders, it was there, always just a few steps behind. When they finally made it back to the hotel, they rushed inside, hearts pounding. They immediately locked the door behind them, feeling the weight of the situation settle over them. "This is getting out of hand," Jake said, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything to happen. Paul nodded grimly. "I think we're in over our heads. Someone doesn't want us here." They both stood in silence, unsure of what to do next. Whatever they had uncovered in the pyramid was bigger than they realized, and now it seemed like there were people or something watching their every move. "I think we should book a flight out of here tonight," Jake suggested, his voice low. Paul agreed, and they both rushed to the front desk. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with dark, tired eyes, greeted them, but When they inquired about flights, his response was unnerving. "I'm sorry, gentlemen," the man said, his tone strangely flat, "but all the flights to the United States have been canceled indefinitely." Jake and Paul exchanged a look of disbelief. "What do you mean canceled? All of them?" Paul asked, his unease growing by the second. The receptionist nodded slowly, as though rehearsing the line. "Yes, the airport has been closed until further notice. No explanation provided. You'll have to wait for an update." They thanked the man and turned away, their minds racing. A wave of panic began to settle over them. Something about this felt wrong, too coordinated, too deliberate. They hadn't heard anything about airport closures before, and the fact that all flights to the U.S. were canceled at once made no sense. "What's going on here, Jake? This isn't just a coincidence, is it?" Paul asked, his voice a whisper. "I don't know, man, but I don't like it," Jake replied, running a hand through his hair. "We need to figure out what's going on." They decided to head out and investigate. Maybe they could find someone at the airport who knew more about the situation or get a glimpse of any irregularities that might explain why they couldn't leave. They took a cab to the airport, but even as they neared it, they could see something was wrong. The streets around the terminal were eerily empty, and the usual bustle of travelers had disappeared. A sense of dread seemed to hang in the air, thick and palpable. As they entered the airport, the usual noise and activity were replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The counters were deserted, the baggage claim area empty. A few airport employees were walking around in a daze, not acknowledging Jake and Paul as they passed. The eerie quiet made their skin crawl. They approached the ticket counter, but before they could speak, a man in a dark suit stepped up beside them. His face was stern, and his cold, calculating gaze locked onto theirs. "I don't believe you're supposed to be here," the man said quietly, his accent heavy. "I suggest you return to your hotel and stay there until further notice." Jake stiffened. The man's words had a strange weight, as if they weren't just a suggestion, but a command. Paul stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" Paul asked, his voice low. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the terminal. Both Jake and Paul exchanged a look, their unease growing. "We're definitely being watched," Jake muttered. They turned to leave the airport, feeling the eyes of strangers on them, though no one was overtly following them. It was the sort of subtle, unnerving presence that made every step feel wrong. Back at the hotel, they packed their bags quickly, deciding to try another way out. They couldn't explain it, but they felt like the world around them was closing in, like they were being pushed into some corner they didn't belong in. Every street, every corner, felt like it was part of some larger trap they hadn't yet figured out. "Let's just get a taxi to the nearest border," Jake suggested. "Maybe we can make it into another country and fly out from there." Paul nodded in agreement, though his mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had already crossed a point of no return, that the strange happenings in the pyramid weren't just random events. Everything that had happened since they discovered the hidden room felt orchestrated, as if someone or something had been guiding them all along. "I don't care what it takes," Paul said. "We just need to get out of here." But as they stepped out into the street, they noticed something that made their hearts race. A black, tinted car was parked across from the hotel. It didn't belong to anyone they recognized. It had been there since they had returned from the airport. The moment they locked eyes with the car, the engine rumbled to life, and it began to move toward them, slowly, as if waiting for them to make a move. Jake and Paul froze. They were being followed. Jake and Paul quickly turned, trying to act casual, though their hearts were racing in their chests. They didn't speak, but the message was clear. They had to get away from the hotel and out of sight. Every step they took felt like it was watched, the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end as they glanced nervously behind them. They made their way down the narrow street, trying to blend into the crowd as best as they could. But no matter how quickly they moved, the dark car kept pace. Every turn they took, the car was still there, just far enough behind to not draw attention, but close enough to make it impossible to ignore. "This is bad, Jake," Paul muttered under his breath, his voice tight with anxiety. "They're onto us. Someone knows what we found in that pyramid." Jake looked over at him, trying to maintain his composure. He was certain now they weren't just dealing with ordinary people. There was something more to all of this, something far beyond anything they'd expected. "We need to get to the nearest exit," Jake said, his voice low. "We need to lose them." They walked faster, cutting down side streets, hoping to throw off their pursuers. But the black car followed every turn, its engine growling in the background. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, and they were starting to realize just how trapped they were. As they neared a small alley, Paul grabbed Jake's arm. "There," he whispered urgently, pointing toward a narrow side street that led toward a busier road. "We can blend in with the crowd, maybe lose them." Jake nodded quickly. The alley was their only hope, and they darted down it, ducking into a building that looked like an abandoned store. They huddled by the door, trying to keep quiet, but they could still hear the sound of the car's engine echoing through the alley. They waited, holding their breath, hoping the car would pass by. Time seemed to slow as the seconds ticked by. Then, suddenly, the sound of the engine grew louder, closer. It was getting nearer. Jake's pulse quickened. Through the crack in the door, they saw the black car slowly roll down the alley. It stopped right in front of their hiding spot. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. They both held their breath, praying they hadn't been seen. The car sat still for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, it reversed, disappearing back into the darkness of the night. Jake and Paul exchanged a relieved look, but didn't dare let their guard down. They waited for a few more minutes before stepping cautiously out into the street. It was quiet now, but the tension in the air was thick, like something dangerous was looming just out of sight. "We're not safe here anymore," Paul said quietly, his eyes scanning the street. "We need to get out of Egypt. Fast." Jake didn't argue. He felt the same. The whole situation had spiraled beyond anything they could have imagined. The pyramid, the strange walls, the odd events, they were in something far bigger than they'd ever expected. The city around them seemed to close in, its walls pressing down on them with an invisible weight. Every step they took felt like it was leading them deeper into a mystery they couldn't escape. They needed answers. But first, they needed to leave. They made their way back to the hotel, but this time, they didn't go inside. They quickly gathered their things, their minds racing with plans to get out of the country. The black car, though it was no longer visible, was a constant presence in their thoughts. As they reached the front door of the hotel, Jake turned to Paul. "We'll figure this out once we're out of here, but we can't wait any longer. Let's get to the border and find a way out." Paul nodded. "I agree. The longer we stay, the worse it's going to get." They stepped into the night, feeling the eyes of unseen watchers on them. The pursuit wasn't over, and the truth, whatever it was still just out of reach. The road ahead would be difficult, but they knew one thing for certain. They had to leave Egypt before it was too late. The next morning, Jake and Paul woke early, their rest disturbed by the uneasy tension that had settled over them since the events of the previous night. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and the sight of the dark car lingering outside the hotel only confirmed their suspicions. As they sat on the edge of their beds, preparing to leave for the day, there was a soft knock at the door. Jake exchanged a glance with Paul before walking over to answer it. He opened the door to find a hotel maid standing there, dressed in the standard uniform, her expression unreadable. "Good morning," she said in a thick accent, her voice low and almost mechanical. "I will be cleaning the room now. You need to leave for a while." Jake hesitated, eyeing the woman carefully. There was something odd about her demeanor, something almost forced in the way she spoke, as if she were delivering a message she had no control over. Her movements were too precise, almost robotic. Sure," Jake said, trying to keep his voice casual. "We'll head out for breakfast. We'll be back in a bit." The maid nodded, stepping aside to let them pass. As they left the room, Paul raised an eyebrow. "That was strange. Did she seem off to you?" Jake shrugged. "Maybe just a weird maid, but after everything that's been going on, I wouldn't be surprised." They made their way downstairs to the hotel lobby, their thoughts still racing from the previous night's events. The maid's strange behavior lingered in the back of their minds, but they pushed it aside for the moment. They needed to get some food and figure out their next move. The sooner they got out of Egypt, the better. The hotel's small dining area was almost empty, save for a few other early risers. Jake and Paul took a seat at a corner table, both of them keeping an eye on the entrance, still on edge. They ordered their breakfast in silence, neither of them saying much, their minds focused on the urgency of the situation. As they ate, they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The maid's odd behavior, the strange phone calls, the black car, it all seemed too much to ignore. And the walls they had seen in the pyramid, those images of UFOs, Bigfoot, and other strange phenomena were still burned into their minds. "We need to figure out who's behind all of this," Paul said quietly, his voice tinged with frustration. "But I don't know where to even begin." Jake looked over at him, his face set in determination. "First things first, we need to get out of here. We'll deal with the rest once we're back home." The thought of leaving Egypt gave him some comfort, but it was only temporary. Even in the safety of the hotel, he still felt the looming presence of something unseen. The night's events had shaken him more than he was willing to admit, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they had stumbled upon in the pyramid wasn't just a fluke. After finishing their meal, they stood to leave. As they headed back toward the stairs, the maid was there, waiting by the door with a strange smile on her face. Her eyes met Jake's, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something flicker in her expression, a glint of recognition of something more than just a simple hotel worker. "Have a good day," she said, her tone almost too sweet. Jake nodded quickly, not wanting to engage any further. The sooner they got out of the hotel, the better. They made their way back to their room, still unsettled by the encounter. Once inside, they gathered their belongings, making sure everything was packed. As they stood in the doorway, ready to leave, Jake glanced over at Paul. "Let's just get out of here." Paul agreed, and together they stepped out into the bustling streets of Cairo, both of them feeling the weight of the past few days pressing down on them. Whatever was happening, they knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stay in Egypt any longer. The strange events were piling up, and with each passing hour, they felt more and more like they were being drawn into something they couldn't control. And as they walked away from the hotel, the sound of the maid's voice, sweet and almost knowing, echoed in their minds, leaving them with one chilling thought. The mystery was far from over. Jake and Paul wandered through the crowded streets of Cairo, the air thick with the heat of midday. As they walked, they exchanged few words, both lost in their thoughts. The maid's strange behavior lingered in their minds, and the weight of the mystery they had uncovered in the pyramid was pressing harder with each step. They stopped at a street vendor to grab a quick drink. As Jake reached into his bag to pay, a wave of frustration washed over him. He fumbled through his belongings, feeling a tightening knot in his chest. "Paul, my flash drive. It's gone." Paul glanced over at him, his expression turning serious. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean, it's not here. Neither is my phone," Jake said, pulling at his bag's straps as if the missing items might just reappear. But the more he searched, the more the reality of it set in. Everything was gone. All the photos, all the evidence of what they had found in the pyramid, the images of UFOs, Bigfoot, and the strange hieroglyphs, they were all lost. Paul's eyes widened in disbelief. "Wait, same here. My phone's gone too." They both pulled out their bags, searching frantically, but there was nothing. No phones, no flash drives, no evidence of what they had experienced deep beneath the pyramid. This doesn't make sense," Paul said, his voice shaky with a mixture of anger and confusion. "We had everything with us. We didn't even leave the room for long." Jake's mind raced. "No, we didn't, but we did leave the room to go down for breakfast. And the maid, she was there right after we came back from the pyramid. What if she took them?" Paul's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "You think she was in on it? That wasn't a real maid?" Jake didn't respond immediately, but his gut told him something wasn't right. The way she had acted, the oddness in her voice, it was as though she was just a tool in a much larger plan, not an innocent hotel worker. "No way this is a coincidence," Jake muttered. "That woman knew exactly when we'd leave the room. And she was just too perfect in the way she played her role. No sign of her when we left the room. It doesn't add up." Paul's mind was spinning, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together in an unsettling way. This isn't just some weird mix-up. Someone's watching us. Someone knew what we had found. Jake clenched his fists, and they knew we had photos. They knew we were onto something. The thought of their discovery being erased, of someone trying to wipe out all the evidence, made Jake feel both helpless and furious. They had stumbled upon something too big to ignore, and now someone was determined to make sure no one ever knew. What if that wasn't even a maid? Paul whispered. What if she was part of whatever is going on here? Jake's mind raced. There were too many unanswered questions. The missing photos, the strange encounters, the black car following them. It was all connected. And they weren't just dealing with some random people. This was bigger. Someone didn't want them to uncover the truth. We need to find out who's behind this, Jake said, his voice low and determined. But first, we need to get out of here. I don't trust anyone in this city anymore. They turned away from the vendor, making their way back to the hotel, their hearts pounding with a sense of urgency. Whoever had taken their phones and flash drives wasn't just trying to stop them. They were trying to bury the truth. Jake stood outside the hotel, his mind racing. The events of the past few days, the strange disappearances, the missing phones and flash drives, it was all starting to get to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on, and it gnawed at him. But Paul, standing beside him, was trying to keep him grounded. Jake, listen, Paul said, his voice calm. It's all right. The photos, they were just empty walls. There was nothing on them. We couldn't have lost anything important. Jake clenched his fists, still frustrated. But why take them? Why erase them? Because there was nothing to erase, Paul replied, his tone reassuring. The walls were blank. You saw it yourself. Nothing was there. No symbols, no figures, just empty space. Jake rubbed his forehead, trying to focus. Yeah, but why do they go through all this trouble if there's nothing to hide? It doesn't make sense. Paul gave him a firm look. What doesn't make sense is stressing over nothing. We didn't lose anything. We never had anything on those photos in the first place. So why are we still letting this get to us? Let's just forget about it. Jake let out a long breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Paul was right. He knew that. The photos were just empty walls, and there was nothing hidden on them. The whole situation still felt strange, but at least they hadn't lost any real evidence. You're right, Jake finally said, his voice quieter now. But still, it feels like someone's been watching us, pulling the strings. Maybe we'll figure it out when we get home. Maybe, Paul agreed. But for now, let's just leave it behind. We've got enough to deal with without chasing shadows. They stood there for a moment, the heat of the Egyptian sun making everything feel surreal. Jake felt the weight of the past few days starting to lift. Maybe they'd never get the answers they were looking for. Maybe there was nothing more to find. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let it go. With a final nod, they turned and headed back toward the hotel, the mystery still lingering in the back of their minds, but a little less pressing than before. When Jake and Paul returned to their hotel room, they immediately noticed something unusual. Their phones and flash drives were neatly arranged in a single row on the desk, as if someone had placed them there intentionally. It was as if they'd never been missing, never been taken. Jake's heart skipped a beat, and his stomach churned with unease. He walked over to the desk, reached for his phone, and turned it on. The screen flashed briefly before it loaded to its home screen. With shaking hands, he opened the gallery app, his eyes scanning for any trace of the photos they'd taken in the pyramid, the ones of the strange underground room. But there was nothing. He checked his phone again. No photos, no images, not a single trace of what they'd captured. He switched over to the flash drives, hoping maybe they had been saved there. But again, empty. His mind raced, confusion flooding him. How could they have all disappeared? He had even tried to recover them earlier, and now everything was wiped clean. Paul stood behind him, peering over his shoulder at the devices. This doesn't make any sense, he muttered. We were looking at the photos right before they disappeared, and now it's like they were never even there. Jake let out a frustrated breath. It's impossible. I remember seeing them clearly, those walls, those markings. They were there. I know they were. Paul frowned, his gaze now scanning the room as though expecting something, anything, to explain what was happening. But there's nothing now. It's like they never existed. The walls, the symbols, the photos, none of it. Jake turned away, his mind racing. I don't understand. Why would they erase everything? There's nothing on those photos, just bare walls. What's the point? Paul shook his head. Maybe we're missing something. Maybe there's a reason we can't remember or keep any of it. But why? Jake's voice cracked with frustration. Why is someone going to all this trouble for nothing? The room felt unnervingly silent, the weight of their unanswered questions pressing down on them. They stood there for a long time, both trying to make sense of what had happened, but neither could come up with a clear answer. After a long pause, Paul finally spoke, his voice quieter now. Maybe we're not supposed to understand. Maybe we just have to leave it, let it go. Jake stared at the empty devices, his heart still heavy with confusion. I don't think we can just let it go, Paul. Something's not right. But for now, they had no choice. There were no photos, no answers. Only questions they couldn't seem to shake. The mystery of the pyramid and everything connected to it remained unsolved. And as much as they wanted to forget it, Jake knew deep down that they never would. The next morning, Jake and Paul woke up early, the events of the previous night still lingering heavily on their minds. They both knew they had to leave Egypt. The strange occurrences, the missing photos, the eerie feeling that something was always watching them. It had all become too much. As they made their way to the hotel lobby to check out, Jake's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his heart giving a small leap. It was a news notification from an app he had installed before the trip. The headline read, "New flights from Cairo to the U.S. available. Airport restores service after previous delays." "Paul, look at this," Jake said, showing him the screen. The news seemed almost too good to be true, considering their previous struggles with canceled flights. Paul's eyes widened. Finally, maybe it's a sign. We've been stuck here long enough. They quickly made their way to the airport, the relief of finally getting the chance to leave Egypt outweighing their lingering doubts and confusion. As they entered the terminal, they saw that things were back to normal. Lines were moving, check-in counters were open, and flights to the United States were indeed available. They stood in line at the ticket counter, staring at the board displaying the departure times. Jake's fingers drummed nervously on the counter as they waited for their turn. The reality of their situation was still setting in. Whatever they had discovered in the pyramid, whatever had happened to their phones and flash drives, still felt unresolved. But as the agent behind the counter confirmed their booking for the next available flight, Jake couldn't help but feel a wave of relief. They were finally leaving this strange place behind. The thought of getting on the plane, of finally heading home, was comforting. The streets of Cairo, the oppressive heat, and the eerie events surrounding the pyramid would soon be nothing more than memories. Their lives would return to normal. Or so they hoped. As they made their way through security and to their gate, there was a sense of finality in the air. It wasn't just about leaving Egypt. It was about leaving behind the unsettling experiences that had followed them from the moment they stepped foot in the country. They boarded the plane, found their seats, and as the aircraft slowly taxied down the runway, both Jake and Paul looked out the windows. The city of Cairo shrank away below them, and the vast desert spread out in the distance. For the first time in weeks, they both felt a strange sense of peace. The flight to the U.S. was long, but it would be their escape, away from the mysteries they couldn't explain, away from the unknown forces they still didn't understand. And yet, as the plane soared higher into the sky, a nagging feeling remained. What had really happened in the pyramid? Would they ever find answers? Would they ever stop feeling like they were being watched? But for now, they had done what they could. They were finally going home. A couple of months had passed since Jake and Paul had returned to the United States. Life had slowly started to return to normal. The strange feeling of being followed had faded, and they hadn't heard from anyone or anything that seemed to be connected to their time in Egypt. The plane ride back had felt like an escape, and for a while, it seemed as though the events they'd experienced in the pyramid might just have been some bizarre, unsettling chapter in their lives they could leave behind. But there was always something nagging at them. Despite the relief of being home, the unanswered questions continued to circle in the back of their minds. The photographs, the missing images, the strange disappearance of their phones and flash drives. It all still felt unresolved. One afternoon, as they sat in Jake's apartment sipping coffee and chatting, Paul broke the silence. "We should try again," he said, tapping his fingers against the table. "I keep thinking about those photos, even though we know they were just empty walls. Maybe there's something we missed, something we can't see with our eyes." Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I agree. It's just so strange that nothing showed up on the files. Not even a blurry image. And the phones and flash drives, they were wiped clean. Almost like someone didn't want us to know what was on them." After a long silence, Jake suddenly stood up, his mind made up. "Let's take them to the experts. There are services that specialize in recovering deleted files. If anything was on those devices, they might be able to get it back. It's worth a shot." Paul looked at him, his eyebrows raised. "You really think they'll be able to recover something from those phones?" Jake shrugged, a mix of hope and uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't know, but I've got to try. I need to know what was on those devices. Even if it's just empty walls, I need to see it for myself." Paul thought about it for a moment. The idea of diving back into the mystery made him feel uneasy, but he could see the resolve in Jake's face. He didn't want to stop him from finding answers, even if it meant digging up things best left buried. "All right, let's do it," Paul agreed. "We've been through too much to just let this go without at least trying." They gathered up the phones and flash drives, making plans to visit a well-known data recovery service in the city. The thought of walking back into a world where the unknown was still waiting for them made Paul feel a little anxious, but Jake's determination was contagious. He couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they would find something that would shed light on what had really happened during their time in Egypt. As they drove to the service, Paul glanced at Jake, who was staring out the window, deep in thought. Paul had no idea what they would find, or if they'd find anything at all. But something inside told him that the mystery wasn't over. Not yet. Maybe they hadn't uncovered everything during their trip. Maybe the answers were still hidden, just waiting for them to discover. Jake and Paul arrived at the data recovery service early that afternoon, the two of them still unsure of what they hoped to find. The process seemed straightforward enough. They handed over the phones and flash drives, explaining their situation and the strange disappearance of the photos they had taken in Egypt. The technician, a middle-aged man with glasses, assured them that the company was one of the best in the city and that they would do everything they could to recover the missing files. He said they could return in a few hours. As they sat in a nearby cafe, the minutes seemed to drag on. Both of them were quiet, lost in their thoughts. The lingering feeling of unease from Egypt still clung to them, but they tried to focus on the present, trying not to get their hopes up too much. When the time came, they returned to the service, their steps heavy with anticipation. The technician greeted them, a slight frown on his face. "We've gone through everything, and we were able to recover the files," he said, pointing to a laptop on the desk. "Here are the photos that were on your devices." Jake and Paul leaned over, scanning the screen. It was full of ordinary, unremarkable pictures, vacation selfies, some random snaps they had taken over the years, but nothing from Egypt. No images of the mysterious underground room, no photos of the strange symbols or figures on the walls. "There's nothing from Egypt?" Paul asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. The technician gave a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Like I said, we're the best at what we do. We've recovered everything that was there. If there had been something, we would have gotten it back. These are all the files that existed on your phones and flash drives." Jake's heart sank. He had been certain that there would be something, anything, that could explain the strange events they had encountered. But there was nothing, just empty space where the missing images should have been. "So, you're saying that there's no chance those files were ever on the devices?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The technician nodded. "Correct. We recover data from devices every day, and we've never missed anything. We've even restored files that were deleted years ago. If there was something on these devices, it would be here." Jake and Paul exchanged a look, the finality of it all sinking in. The mystery they had been chasing, the strange events they had experienced, seemed to be slipping through their fingers. The photos they had thought would hold the answers were gone, and no one seemed to believe they had ever existed in the first place. After a long moment of silence, Paul sighed, his shoulders sagging. Well, I guess that's it then. We've been chasing ghosts. Jake gave a slow nod. Yeah, maybe it's time we let this go. We've got nothing left to go on. No photos, no evidence. As they left the service and walked out into the crisp evening air, the weight of the mystery finally started to lift. They'd spent so much time looking for something they couldn't quite define, and now, with no photos or evidence to back it up, they were left with nothing but a feeling they couldn't shake. Sitting down at a cafe, they ordered tea, the quiet hum of the city surrounding them. I guess we'll just never know what happened over there, Jake said, staring into his cup. Paul looked at him and nodded. Yeah, but maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left unexplored. They both sat in silence for a while, allowing the tension to ease. They were tired, exhausted even, from the chase. And finally, it felt like they could close the door on the whole Egypt adventure. The mystery was over, and with that, they both agreed. Some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. The end. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories.